Let's now speak to SABC News anchor Thembekile Mrototo as well as senior news reporter Canny Maphanga, joining us live there from the Madlanga Commission. Thembekile, a tough 5 days on the stand then for the former IDEC head. She'd asked, earlier on, she was asked that the commission concludes with her testimony today, so that brief adjournment. She has, in the last hour or so, Thembekile, conceded on a number of issues, including admitting that she can no longer deny that IDEC operated outside of its mandate. Just how significant is that concession, given what has been revealed at the commission to date, insofar as to why and how IDEC went about and beyond its mandate in its investigations?
Good afternoon, Unati. So it's all very significant because consider this, while we have all been hearing days of evidence at this point regarding how IDEC went beyond its mandate in investigating issues to do with crime intelligence, today we're now dealing with how IDEC, in what we're seeing in this pattern regarding it stepping out of its mandate, investigations into the political killings task team. The political killings task team is a big deal in terms of why this very commission, the Maphanga Commission, even exists. It was one of the issues raised by the KZN Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi during his briefing in July. And at issue at the time was that the then police minister, who's now on leave, Senzo Mchunu, had seemingly decided overnight that he wanted to get rid of the political killings task team. He claimed at the time that because it was a task team, its mandate was always going to be time-bound, but we know there are questions about whether those were honest motivations or motives for the disestablishment, or at least the attempt to disestablish the political killings task team. And Andrea Johnson was asked in the last while if, in fact, that was one of the issues that came up when she met with Minister Mchunu at some point after his appointment following the 2024 elections. She describes their meeting, in fact, as more of a meet and greet, if you will, and says there was a criminal matter that the minister wanted to discuss, and that once she had established that that very criminal issue that Mchunu wanted to discuss was beyond the mandate of IDEC, she then left the meeting. Earlier, we heard one of the commissioners, Commissioner Khumalo, in fact, talk about how in all of what IDEC has been doing, there appears to have been, in terms of the motivations, possibly an external hand that may have been driving the actions that Advocate Johnson, has so far been unable to explain or put into context that makes sense legally, and once again within the mandate of her office. Let's bring in SABC News senior reporter Canny Maphanga, who's with me here in Pretoria at the Bridget Mabandla Justice College. Canny, let's pick up on that very issue, right? What Commissioner Khumalo said earlier regarding this emerging pattern of IDEC going beyond the scope of its work, and how that may, on his reading, be something that may have been motivated, in fact, by an external factor, possibly more nefarious.
And this all starts in the inclusion of the PKTT in the subpoena. That's item 6 of the subpoena to the National Commissioner. We're seeing that at the very beginning, Johnson tried to claim that she was not aware of any IDEC investigation into PKTT, and that she wasn't wary of the media articles surrounding what would have been at the time the disbandment of the PKTT, because we do know that this subpoena in April of 2025 happens after the disbandment decision, or the so-called, or rather purported disbandment decision, because the Commission still needs to decide which conclusion it is reaching. It actually is triggered by one of our very own, that's our colleague Thembekile Masego. He's the one that actually broke the story in January, and of course that then gave it massive media coverage going forward, leading up to the July media briefing. But even prior to the July media briefing, which she tries to attribute as the main place where it became big, it's quite clear that from Thembekile Masego's tweet that this was quite a big story that was making the rounds and really had shocked members who were part of the PKTT and interested parties, as well as members of the public. And effectively what is being alleged here is that when she took the decision, or rather signed or authorized the subpoena that had item 6 that wanted information on upon the commanders and members of the PKTT, that should have been in her mind. And it cannot be accepted that that was something that she wouldn't have known at the time when she authorized that. But it's another example of them taking a portion or an allegation in Fadio Adams' statement and using it to investigate something that has nothing to do with what Adams was alleging in the statement. In this regard, it had to do with the appointment of Lieutenant General Thembekile by the previous minister, Thembekile. But what then happens is an information sought with respect to things that go far beyond that particular scope. And the question is why? And we eventually get to the elephant in the room, which then discusses the assertions about this focus on crime intelligence and some of these top cops.
And by the way, for everyone who was wondering what the announcement was, that was Jeremy Michaels, the Commission spokesperson, announcing that because when we took this break, we didn't know how long we were going to be. We're going to resume now at 4:30. This is a tea break officially. There's also going to be conversation going on behind the scenes between the evidence leaders and Advocate Johnson regarding her availability, because she does want to conclude today. But Canny, on what you were just talking about, and we've got time, I think, so we can do it in chronological order. On Thembekile, one of the questions then that then came up from the commissioners, in fact, was why wasn't he investigated if IDAC was so clearly set on looking at issues where his name does come up rather prominently?
And that feeds again into the assertions surrounding the allegations about the motives of IDAC, because it seems that there were specific people in mind. If you look at the inclusion of the PKTT, we do know that Lieutenant General Thembekile served a bit of a drill role there. He was the head of crime intelligence, but he was also running, or rather the commander of the PKTT. And at the time, they were closing in on a number of alleged cartel members. It also ties into evidence that where people were looking for ways to find an avenue to allegedly go after Khumalo. So it was also the arrest, or rather the probe into the stealing of certain assets in Vusimuzi Kat Matlala's home, or the allegations surrounding that, and the case that was open to that effect. So it speaks to a continuous effort to allegedly target these individuals. And the overall elephant in the room, as the Commission started to look at the possible motivation behind the actions, is it was put to her that what it looks like was allegedly a coordinated attack against General Fani Masemola, Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, and Lieutenant General Khumalo. And she's in a different position now because she's no longer sitting as the IDAC head. She's here as the former IDAC head, and she could concede as to why it could be viewed that particular way, or why someone would draw that particular conclusion upon looking at all of these different statements, and how there's a common pattern emerging of them taking a portion or an allegation in Fadio Adams' statement and using that to springboard themselves into a different parallel investigation that seemingly always wants to target these individuals within crime intelligence, and of course these top cops that are alleged to be on the other side, if you put it that way. And that's what it's pointing to. And obviously she's in a position now where she's no longer the IDAC head, so the concessions are a bit easier in that regard, but that's what the evidence points to so far.
Two things we should squeeze in that are very important. Medicare 24, you brought up Kat Matlala, that's come up in the last half an hour, as has the minister who's on leave, Senzo Mchunu. Tie those two elements up for us in terms of what Advocate Johnson is now going to have to explain when we come back from tea.
Well, there are a number of inferences about the Medicare 24 contract and the desperation, if we could put it that way, for Kat Matlala to preserve that particular contract. That brings us to individuals such as Brian Mahotsi, Shadrack Sibiya, and Senzo Mchunu. And you must also read all of these actions together with the disbandment decision and whether or not IDAC was allegedly being used as a tool to fight those political battles. So we're looking at the theme of alleged political interference there now, and whether or not the motive behind the conduct can be rooted in some of the actions of the alleged actions, let's put it that way, of the minister. So it's about closing in on the possible motivation behind IDAC's conduct, which I think so far in terms of these investigations has suggested that it's an abuse of power, allegedly, and people went beyond their scope and their mandate. The only question that remains in the air is the motivation. So it's about getting to whether or not this was alleged political interference. Was this allegedly a hidden hand, a different party? What was the motive behind IDAC's concentration or interest in these particular generals within crime intelligence? And of course, now what's being added is the political killings task team.
Canny, for now, thank you. So Canny brings us to 4:20. The Madlanga Commission will continue to deal with testimony from Advocate Andrea Johnson, the now former head of the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption. That's at 4:30. But this brings us to a nice point, perhaps, to catch up on the day's other news, Unati, because there has been plenty going on elsewhere.